The morning air was crisp when Margaret pulled into the parking lot of the Veterans Affairs Hospital. It was just past 7, and the sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the empty spaces. She liked arriving early. It gave her time to set up the check-in desk, make the first pot of coffee, and prepare herself for whatever the day might bring. Margaret was 68 years old. With silver hair she always wore pinned back neatly. She'd been volunteering at this hospital for 3 years now, ever since her husband passed. The house had felt too quiet after he was gone, and she needed something to fill her days. Someone at church had mentioned they needed volunteers at the VA hospital, and it seemed like a good fit. She'd always been good with people, patient and kind. She unlocked the main entrance and made her way to her station near the front doors. The desk wasn't much to look at, just a simple counter with a computer, a sign-in sheet, and a box of visitor badges. But it was important work. People coming to the VA were often confused, sometimes upset, and almost always dealing with something difficult. A friendly face at the front desk could make all the difference. By 8 o'clock, the first visitors started trickling in. An elderly woman looking for the cardiology department, a middle-aged man trying to find his father's room. Margaret directed them with practiced ease, offering encouraging words and clear directions. This was her routine, and she found comfort in it. Around 9:30, she noticed something different. More elderly men than usual were coming through the doors. They wore baseball caps with military unit numbers stitched on them. Some had on jackets covered in patches and pins. A few walked slowly with canes. Others rolled in wheelchairs pushed by younger family members. "Is there something special happening today?" Margaret asked one of the hospital staff members passing by. "Oh, didn't anyone tell you? There's a Vietnam veterans reunion in the community center next door. They're expecting about 200 people throughout the day. Some of them might come through here to use our restrooms or get coffee." Margaret nodded and made a mental note to brew extra coffee. She watched as small groups of these men passed by her desk, their conversations filled with military terms she didn't quite understand. They talked about places with strange names, about helicopters and fire bases, about people who weren't there anymore. Their voices carried both laughter and something heavier, something that had weight to it even after all these years. One man stopped at her desk to ask where the restrooms were. He looked to be in his early 70s, thin and weathered, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Right down that hallway, second door on the left," Margaret told him with a smile. "Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate it." He started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "You know, you remind me of someone. Can't quite place it, but there's something familiar about you." Margaret felt a small flutter in her chest, but she kept her smile steady. "I just have one of those faces, I suppose." "Everyone says that." The man nodded slowly, still studying her, then continued down the hallway. Margaret watched him go, her hands suddenly cold despite the warmth of the building. The morning continued. More veterans filtered through, some stopping to chat, others moving past with purpose. Margaret poured coffee, handed out directions, and listened to fragments of stories about a war that had ended 50 years ago. She kept her composure, her professional volunteer demeanor firmly in place. But inside something was shifting. Memories she'd kept locked away for decades were pushing against the door she'd built to contain them. The smell of the hospital, the sound of men's voices talking about Vietnam, the way some of them walked with that particular military bearing even in their old age. It all brought back things she'd promised herself she'd never think about again. Around 11, a man in a wheelchair rolled up to her desk. He was being pushed by a younger woman, probably his daughter. He had the look of someone who'd lived a hard life but survived it, with deep lines around his eyes and a scar that ran along his jawline. "Excuse me, miss," the woman said. "We're looking for the reunion registration. I think we might have come in the wrong building." "You're close," Margaret replied. "It's in the community center right next door. If you go out these doors and turn right, you'll see the entrance about 50 feet down." The man in the wheelchair hadn't moved his gaze from Margaret's face. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, knuckles white. "Dad, did you hear that? We need to go next door," his daughter said. But the man didn't respond. He just kept staring. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Angel 9. The world seemed to stop. Margaret's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the desk. Those 2 words, that call sign, hadn't been spoken to her in more than 50 years. She'd buried it so deep that sometimes she could almost convince herself it had never been real, that it was just a dream she'd once had. "I'm sorry," she managed to say, though her voice didn't sound like her own. The man's eyes filled with tears. His hands were trembling now. "Angel 9, that's you." "I know it's you." His daughter looked confused, glancing between her father and Margaret. "Dad, what are you talking about?" But the man wasn't listening to his daughter. He was somewhere else, in another time, another place. "You pulled me out," he said. "December 1969. I was hit bad, thought I was done for. But you came. You flew right into that hell and you pulled me out." Margaret felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Other people in the lobby were starting to notice the commotion. Another elderly veteran had stopped walking and was now staring at her too. "Sir, I think you might have me confused with someone else," Margaret said. But her words lacked conviction. The second veteran moved closer, his eyes wide. "Wait a minute. Angel 9? Is that really possible?" He turned to the man in the wheelchair. "Are you sure?" "I'd know her anywhere," the first man said. "Some faces you don't forget. Some people you don't forget." Now a small crowd was gathering. 3 more elderly men had heard the commotion and were converging on the desk. One of them pulled out his phone and showed something to the others. They looked at the screen, then at Margaret, then back at the screen. "It's her," one of them said with absolute certainty. "Look at the eyes. It's the same. That's Angel 9. Margaret stood frozen behind her desk as the reality she'd run from for 50 years finally caught up with her. These men, these elderly veterans with their canes and wheelchairs and decades of life behind them, they'd been boys once. Boys she'd held. Boys she'd promised would be okay. Boys she'd pulled from places no one should ever have to go. And now they were here, recognizing her, calling her by a name she thought had died in the jungles of Vietnam. The lobby of the VA hospital had gone from quiet to chaotic in a matter of minutes. Margaret stood behind her desk, her legs feeling weak, as more elderly veterans gathered around. Word was spreading through the building and into the community center next door. Angel 9 was here. After all these years, she was here. A hospital security guard approached, concerned about the growing crowd. "Ma'am, is everything all right here? Do you need assistance?" Before Margaret could answer, one of the veterans spoke up. "Everything's fine, son. Better than fine. We just found someone we've been looking for since 1970. The guard looked confused but backed off, keeping a watchful eye on the situation. The director of the volunteer program, Mrs. Chen, pushed through the small crowd with worry on her face. "Margaret, what's going on? Should I call someone?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she explain this? How could she put into words something she'd never even told her own children? The man in the wheelchair, whose daughter still looked completely bewildered, reached out his hand toward Margaret. "Please," he said softly, "don't run from us. We've waited so long to thank you." Something in his voice broke through Margaret's shock. She looked at his face, really looked at it, and tried to see the young soldier he'd once been, tried to remember him through the decades that separated then from now. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "Robert. Robert Chen. You probably wouldn't remember me. There were so many. But I remember you. I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, bleeding from shrapnel wounds. You climbed down from that helicopter while bullets were still flying. You told me I was going to be fine, that you'd get me home to my mama. And you did." Tears were streaming down Robert's face now. His daughter had her hand on his shoulder, still trying to understand what was happening. Margaret felt her own eyes filling up. "I remember," she whispered. And she did. Once she allowed herself to look back, the memories came flooding in. Robert had been hit during a patrol. 3 men down. She'd been flying her second mission of the day. They'd landed in a clearing while the firefight was still active. The pilot had wanted to leave faster, but she'd insisted on stabilizing Robert first. Another veteran stepped forward. He was taller, with a thick gray beard and a cane with military insignia on it. "I was there too. Different mission, different day. March 1970. You held my hand the whole flight back. I was so scared, and you kept talking to me about baseball. You asked me who my favorite player was. I said Hank Aaron, and you told me about seeing him play once. I don't know if that story was even true, but it kept me focused on something other than the pain." "It was true," Margaret said, and a small, sad smile crossed her face. "My father took me to a game in 1957. I was just a girl." The bearded veteran, whose name was Henry, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. You saved my life. Not just because you stopped the bleeding, but because you made me want to stay alive. You made me remember there was a world outside of that war. By now, at least 15 veterans had gathered around the desk. Some of them had been on Margaret's helicopter. Others had only heard stories. In the medevac units, the flight nurses became legends. Angel 9 had been one of the best, they said. Fearless, competent, kind even in the middle of chaos. An older woman pushed through the crowd. She was one of the hospital administrators, and she'd been alerted about the commotion. But when she saw what was happening, when she heard the fragments of conversation, her professional concern shifted to something else. "Is it true?" she asked Margaret. "You were a flight nurse in Vietnam?" Margaret nodded slowly. She couldn't deny it anymore. These men had recognized her, had called her by her old call sign. The past had found her, and there was no hiding from it now. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Mrs. Chen asked gently. "In 3 years of volunteering, you never mentioned this." "Because I wanted to forget," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "I spent 50 years trying to forget." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite true. You don't forget something like that. You can bury it, lock it away, build a whole life on top of it. But forget it? Never. A younger man approached, maybe in his 50s, with a notebook in his hand. He introduced himself as a reporter from the local paper who'd been covering the reunion. "Ma'am, I don't mean to intrude, but this is an incredible story. Would you be willing to talk about your service?" "No," Margaret said immediately. "I don't think so. I don't—" "She saved my life," Robert interrupted from his wheelchair. "She saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds, and nobody even knows her name." "They don't need to know," Margaret protested weakly. "Yes, they do," said another voice. A woman about Margaret's age had joined the group. She wore a jacket with Vietnam Veterans of America embroidered on it. "I was a nurse too. Army, not Navy, but I was there. And I know what you went through. I know what it cost. And I know why you never talked about it." The two women locked eyes, and in that moment something passed between them. An understanding. A recognition of shared trauma, shared silence, shared survival. "They spit on us when we came home," the woman continued, her voice steady but emotional. "They called us names. They protested our hospitals. So we learned to keep quiet. We took off our uniforms and we disappeared into regular life. But that doesn't mean what we did wasn't important. It doesn't mean these men don't deserve to thank us." The lobby had grown quiet. Even the veterans who didn't know Margaret personally were listening now, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious. Robert's daughter spoke up for the first time. "My father has talked about Angel 9 my entire life. When I was little, he used to tell me stories about a nurse who was braver than any soldier he knew. I thought she was almost like a myth, you know? Like a guardian angel story. But you're real. You're actually real." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. All these years she'd thought of herself as just a teacher, just a volunteer, just a widow trying to fill her days. She'd pushed down the memories of helicopters and blood and fear. She'd convinced herself that person didn't exist anymore. But looking at these faces, seeing the gratitude and emotion in their eyes, she realized that person had always existed. She'd just been hiding. "I don't know what to say," Margaret admitted. "I was just doing my job." "We all were? Just your job?" Henry with the beard shook his head. "Ma'am, you flew into combat zones. You treated critical injuries in the back of a shaking helicopter. You worked in conditions that would break most people. That's not just a job. That's heroism." Margaret wanted to protest, to deflect the praise, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, buried under 50 years of silence and civilian life, part of her knew the truth. What she'd done had mattered. Who she'd been had mattered. Mrs. Chen touched Margaret's arm gently. "Why don't we move this to somewhere more comfortable? The community center has a meeting room. We can all sit down and talk properly." Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, young and old, veterans and family members, hospital staff, and even a few curious patients who'd wandered over to see what was happening. And for the first time in 5 decades, she didn't feel the need to run from her past. "Okay," she said softly. "Yes, let's do that." As the group began moving toward the community center, Robert reached out and took Margaret's hand. His grip was weak from age, but there was strength in it too. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for everything." Margaret squeezed his hand back, and something inside her that had been frozen for 50 years finally began to thaw. The meeting room in the community center was packed. What had started as a small group in the hospital lobby had grown to nearly 50 people. Veterans kept arriving as word spread through the reunion. Some came out of curiosity, others because they remembered the call sign Angel 9, and a few because they swore they'd been on her helicopter. Margaret sat in a folding chair at the front of the room, feeling exposed and strange. For 3 years, she'd been the quiet volunteer at the check-in desk. Now she was the center of attention, and it made her deeply uncomfortable. She kept her hands folded in her lap, trying to stop them from shaking. Robert was next to her, still in his wheelchair. Henry sat on her other side. They'd appointed themselves as her protectors, though Margaret suspected they were really just afraid she might disappear if they let her out of their sight. The reporter from the local paper sat in the back, his notebook ready. Mrs. Chen had asked Margaret if it was okay for him to stay, and Margaret had nodded. She wasn't sure if it was okay, but she also wasn't sure she had the right to refuse anymore. These men wanted to tell their stories, and she was part of them. So how did this happen? Someone asked from the crowd. How does a flight nurse just disappear for 50 years? Margaret took a deep breath. She hadn't told this story out loud in so long. Her husband had known bits and pieces, but never the full truth. Her children knew she'd been in the Navy, but she'd always been vague about the details. She'd let them assume she'd worked in a hospital somewhere safe. When I came home in 1970, she began, her voice quiet, things were different than when I'd left. People were angry about the war. There were protests everywhere. And women who'd served, we were in a strange position. Some people didn't think we should have been there at all. Others didn't believe we'd really been in danger. She paused, remembering. I landed in California in my uniform. I was 24 years old and I'd spent 14 months in Vietnam. I'd seen things that gave me nightmares. I'd held dying boys in my arms. I'd worked until I was so exhausted I could barely stand. And when I walked through the airport, someone spit on me. The room went completely silent. Even the veterans who'd heard similar stories looked pained. A woman, actually. She was about my age. She called me a war criminal. Said I should be ashamed. Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. That wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that nobody defended me. People just walked by like nothing was happening. Henry put his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and support. So I went home to Virginia, to my parents' house, and I took off my uniform. My mother wanted to have a welcome home party, but I said no. I didn't want anyone to know where I'd been. I just wanted to forget. But how do you forget something like that? Asked the female veteran who'd spoken up earlier in the lobby. Her name was Linda, and she'd been an Army nurse at an evacuation hospital. You don't, Margaret admitted. You can't, but you can bury it. You can build a new life on top of it. I went back to school and got my teaching certificate. I became a second-grade teacher. I met my husband Richard at a church social. He'd been in the Navy too, but he'd served on a ship, never saw combat. He understood that I didn't want to talk about my time in Vietnam, and he never pushed. Did you have nightmares? Linda asked gently. Margaret nodded. For years. The sound of helicopters would make me panic. The smell of certain antiseptics would bring me right back to the field hospitals. I learned to avoid things that triggered memories. I built a quiet, peaceful life. Taught children to read. Raised my own children. Volunteered at church. I became someone completely different from Lieutenant Margaret Hayes, flight nurse. Hayes? Robert looked startled. Your last name was Hayes back then? Yes, I got married in 1972, became Margaret Brennan. It felt strange to say her old name out loud. She'd been Margaret Brennan for so long that sometimes she almost forgot she'd ever been anyone else. A man in the back raised his hand. He was older than most of the others, probably in his late 70s. Ma'am, I wasn't on your helicopter, but I was in the same unit. I was a door gunner on Angel 7. I remember you. You were the toughest nurse we had. You never hesitated, never backed down. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was just doing what needed to be done. You all were too. But it was different for you, the man insisted. We were trained for combat. You were a nurse. You were supposed to be in a safe hospital somewhere. But there you were, flying into hot zones, working on guys while we were taking fire. I saw you once, covered in blood, calm as anything, telling a wounded soldier a joke while you worked on him. That's not just training. That's courage. The memories were coming faster now, whether Margaret wanted them or not. She could see the inside of the Huey helicopter, feel the vibration of the rotors, hear the crackle of the radio. She could smell the metallic scent of blood mixed with jet fuel. She could see the faces of the wounded, so young, so scared. I flew my first mission 3 days after I arrived in country. She heard herself saying, I thought I was prepared. I'd been through all the training. But nothing prepares you for the reality, the heat, the noise, the chaos, and the wounds. Some of these boys had injuries I'd only seen in textbooks. What was the hardest part? Asked Robert's daughter, who'd been listening intently. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. The ones I couldn't save. We saved so many. The statistics were amazing compared to previous wars. But there were still the ones we lost. Those were the faces I saw in my nightmares. The boys who died in my arms on the way to the hospital. The ones who were too far gone when we got to them. The room had grown heavy with emotion. These veterans understood loss in a way that civilians never could. They'd all lost friends, witnessed deaths, carried guilt for surviving when others didn't. There was one mission, Margaret continued, her voice distant. November 1969. We got a call for a mass casualty situation. An ambush, multiple wounded. When we landed, there were 7 men down. We could only take 4 at a time. I had to make choices about who went first. I had to look at those boys and decide who was critical but savable, and who might have to wait for the next helicopter. She opened her eyes and looked around the room. That's what people don't understand about war. The impossible choices, the split-second decisions that determine who lives and who dies. I was 23 years old and I was playing God. But you saved them, Henry said firmly. You made the best choices you could. You saved the ones you could save. Did I? Margaret's voice cracked. Sometimes I wonder, what if I'd chosen differently? What if I'd taken a different man on that first run? Would more have survived? Linda stood up and walked to the front of the room. She knelt in front of Margaret and took both her hands. Listen to me. I know this guilt. I carried it for decades. But you need to hear this. You did your best. Under impossible circumstances with limited resources. In the middle of a war zone, you did your absolute best. That's all any of us could do. Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now. I never talked about it. Not really. Not to anyone. I thought if I just pushed it down deep enough, if I focused on my teaching and my family, it would eventually fade away. But it doesn't fade, does it? Linda said softly. No, it doesn't. Robert wheeled his chair closer. Ma'am, I want to tell you something. After you pulled me out, after I recovered and came home, I struggled. I had PTSD, though we didn't call it that back then. I drank too much. I pushed people away. But there was one memory that kept me going. It was your voice in that helicopter, telling me I was going to be okay, telling me I had a future. You gave me hope when I had none. I gave hope to a lot of people, Henry added. The stories about Angel 9 spread through the units. Guys would say, if you get hit, pray Angel 9 is flying that day. You were a legend. Margaret shook her head, overwhelmed. I wasn't a legend. I was just a scared young woman trying to help. You can be both, Linda said. The reporter in the back cleared his throat. Ms. Brennan, can I ask what made you volunteer at the VA hospital? Was it connected to your service? Margaret considered the question. I don't know. Maybe. After Richard died, I needed something to do. Someone mentioned the VA needed volunteers and something about it felt right. I told myself it was just about helping people, giving back to the community. But maybe on some level I was trying to reconnect with a part of myself I'd been hiding. And now? The reporter asked. Margaret looked around the room at all these faces. Veterans who'd survived the war, family members who'd grown up hearing stories, hospital staff who were seeing her in a completely new light, and Linda, the fellow nurse who understood in a way no one else could. Now, Margaret said slowly, I think maybe it's time to stop hiding. The meeting in the community center lasted nearly 3 hours. One by one, veterans stood up to share their stories. Some had been on Margaret's helicopter. Others had simply heard the legends about Angel 9. A few shared stories about different flight nurses, wanting to honor all the women who'd served in that dangerous role. Margaret listened to each story, sometimes nodding in recognition, other times hearing about missions she'd completely blocked from her memory. It was exhausting and emotional, and strangely healing all at once. As the gathering finally began to wind down, a veteran named Walter approached Margaret. He was in his mid-70s with thick glasses and a gentle manner. He'd been quiet throughout the meeting, sitting in the back and taking everything in. "Ma'am, I need to tell you about something," he said. "It's about Old Bell." Margaret looked at him, puzzled. "Old Bell?" Walter nodded. "After the war, a group of us from the medevac unit started meeting up. Just informally at first, then we made it an annual thing. We wanted to remember the people who brought us home. The pilots, the crew chiefs, the medics, and especially the flight nurses." He pulled out his phone and showed Margaret a photograph. It was a brass ship's bell mounted on a wooden plaque. The bell was tarnished with age, and its surface was covered in engraved names. "We bought this bell in 1975, Walter explained. "We put it up at our VFW hall. Every name on that bell is someone from the medevac units. The ones who didn't make it home are at the top. Below that are the call signs of the helicopters and the people who flew them. And right here," he pointed to a spot on the bell. "That's you, Angel 9. Margaret stared at the photograph. There it was, her old call sign engraved in brass. Permanent. Real. Proof that it had all happened, that she hadn't just imagined that part of her life. "We never knew your real name," Walter continued. "You disappeared after the war. We looked. But back then, without the internet, it was almost impossible to track someone down. All we had was your call sign and memories of your face. So we just engraved Angel 9 and hoped that somehow, someday, you'd know you were remembered." Margaret's hand trembled as she held the phone, zooming in on the image to see the engraving more clearly. Angel 9, surrounded by other call signs she remembered. Angel 7, Dustoff 23, Medevac 12, names of crew members she'd flown with. Some of them had made it home. Some hadn't. "Where's this bell now?" she asked quietly. "It's at a small military museum in North Carolina. The VFW hall closed down about 10 years ago, and we didn't want the bell to end up in storage somewhere, so we donated it to the museum. They keep it in a special section dedicated to Vietnam medevac units." Robert, who'd been listening, wheeled closer. "We need to take you there. You need to see it in person. You need to ring that bell. Ring it." Margaret looked confused. "It's a tradition," Walter explained. "When someone visits the museum, if their name or call sign is on the bell, they ring it. Once for each mission they flew, or once for each person they saved, or just once to say, 'I'm still here.' However feels right to them." The idea of it overwhelmed Margaret. A bell with her call sign on it, waiting for her in a museum she'd never visited. All these years, while she'd been teaching second grade and volunteering at hospitals and trying to forget, there had been a bell with her name on it, kept by men who'd never forgotten her. "I don't know how many missions I flew," Margaret admitted. "I stopped counting after a while. It felt like tempting fate." Henry spoke up from across the room. "I've got the unit records. My son helped me look them up a few years ago when I was putting together a scrapbook for my grandkids. I can find out exactly how many missions Angel 9 flew if you want to know." Margaret wasn't sure if she wanted to know. Numbers would make it concrete, impossible to minimize or push away. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time to face the full reality of what she'd done, what she'd survived. "Okay," she said. "Yes, I want to know." Over the next hour, as people started to leave and the room emptied out, a small core group remained. Margaret, Robert, Henry, Walter, Linda, and a few others who seemed to have appointed themselves as keepers of this story. They exchanged phone numbers and email addresses. They made plans. Henry promised to email Margaret the mission records within a few days. Walter said he'd contact the museum in North Carolina and arrange a special visit. Robert's daughter said she wanted to write an article about her father's story, about finding Angel 9 after all these years. The local reporter asked if he could do a feature story for the paper. Margaret agreed to all of it, even though part of her wanted to refuse, wanted to go back to being invisible. But she'd crossed a line today. There was no going back to the woman who'd arrived at the hospital that morning, ready for an ordinary day of volunteer work. As the group finally dispersed, Linda pulled Margaret aside. "Can I give you some advice?" "Please. This is going to be hard. Harder than you think. Once you open up about your service, once the story gets out, you're going to feel exposed, vulnerable. Old memories are going to surface, things you haven't thought about in years. Make sure you have support. Talk to someone, maybe a counselor who specializes in PTSD." Margaret bristled slightly. "I don't have PTSD, that was 50 years ago." Linda gave her a knowing look. "Did you have nightmares? Avoid certain sounds or smells?" Feel anxious in crowds? Push people away? Minimize your own experiences? Well, yes, but that's PTSD. Just because you learn to function with it doesn't mean it's not there. And bringing all of this back to the surface, it's going to stir things up. Trust me on this. I went through it when I finally started dealing with my own service. It was hard, but it was worth it. Margaret nodded slowly. How did you do it? How did you finally talk about it? I found a veteran support group for women. That helped more than anything. Being around other women who understood, who'd been through similar things. You spend decades thinking you're the only one who feels this way, and then you meet others and you realize you're not alone. Are there groups around here? Linda smiled. I'll send you information. There's a women veterans group that meets in Richmond twice a month. I go whenever I can. You'd be welcome. The idea of sitting in a room with other female veterans talking about experiences she'd kept hidden for 50 years terrified Margaret, but it also felt necessary, like something she should have done decades ago. Mrs. Chen found Margaret as she was preparing to leave. Take tomorrow off, she said firmly. Take the rest of the week if you need it. This has been a lot. I'm supposed to work the morning shift tomorrow. I'll cover it. You need time to process this. Margaret wanted to argue, to insist she was fine, that she could handle it. But the truth was she was exhausted, emotionally drained. The adrenaline that had been keeping her going was fading, and she felt shaky and raw. She drove home in a daze, her mind replaying the events of the day. The shock of hearing her old call sign, the faces of the men she'd saved, the stories they'd shared, the photograph of the bell with her name on it. When she got home, she stood in her quiet living room and looked around. The house was the same as it had been that morning. The same furniture, the same photographs on the walls, the same peaceful silence. But she was different. She felt different. Margaret walked to her bedroom and opened her closet. In the back, behind her regular clothes, was a box she hadn't opened in years. She pulled it out and sat on her bed, the box in her lap. Inside were the things she'd saved from Vietnam. Not many. She'd thrown away most of it when she came home, wanting to erase that chapter of her life. But there were a few items she hadn't been able to destroy. A photograph of her in her flight suit standing in front of a helicopter. She looked so young, so serious. Her name tag was visible, Lilton Hayes, a set of silver wings, the insignia of a flight nurse. She'd worn these on her uniform every day for 14 months, a small notebook where she'd written down the names of every soldier she could remember treating. She'd kept it during her first few months in Vietnam, but then it had become too much. Too many names, too many faces. She'd stopped writing them down. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a letter from a soldier she'd helped save. He'd tracked her down at the hospital where she'd been stationed and had given her the letter before she rotated home. She'd read it once, then put it away and never looked at it again. With trembling hands, Margaret unwrapped the tissue paper and unfolded the letter. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the words were still clear. Dear Lieutenant Hayes, I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saved my life. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. When I was lying there bleeding, I'd given up. I thought I was going to die in that jungle, thousands of miles from home. But then you arrived and everything changed. You looked at me and you saw a person, not just another casualty. You told me your name. You asked about my family. You made me remember who I was beyond the war. I'm going home next week and I'm going home alive because of you. I hope you make it home safe too. I hope you have a good life. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Thank you, Angel 9. Thank you for giving me a future. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she carefully refolded it and placed it back in the box with everything else. For 50 years, she'd told herself that what she'd... 3 weeks passed between that day at the hospital and the trip to North Carolina. 3 weeks that changed everything for Margaret. The first change came 2 days after the reunion when Henry emailed her the mission records. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her as she read through the official documentation of her service. Lieutenant Margaret Hayes, callsign Angel 9, had flown 127 medevac missions between August 1969 and October 1970. She'd helped evacuate 342 wounded soldiers. The records noted 3 missions where her helicopter had taken enemy fire. 1 mission where she'd received a commendation for refusing to leave a landing zone until all wounded were loaded, despite being under active attack. Margaret read the numbers over and over. Fun 27 missions, 342 soldiers. She'd known it was a lot, but seeing it written down in official military records made it real in a way her memories never had. She called her daughter that evening. Catherine lived in Maryland with her husband and 2 teenage kids. They talked every week, but this call was different. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound strange." Margaret took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something. About my time in the Navy, about Vietnam." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Okay, I'm listening." And for the first time in her children's lives, Margaret told the truth. The whole truth. She told Catherine about being a flight nurse, about flying into combat zones, about the young men she'd saved and the ones she couldn't. She told her about the nightmares, the guilt, the decision to never speak about it. Catherine was quiet for a long moment after Margaret finished. Then she said, her voice thick with emotion, "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us? I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I could just be a normal mother, a teacher, someone with a quiet life, that would be better than being someone who'd been to war. But you're both. You're allowed to be both." Those words echoed what Linda had said, what several of the veterans had said. Margaret was beginning to understand that maybe they were right. She called her son next, who lived in California. His reaction was similar to his sister's. Shock, followed by emotion, followed by the same question. "Why didn't you tell us?" "I'm telling you now," Margaret said. "Better late than never, I hope." The local newspaper ran the story 3 days later. The reporter had done a beautiful job, focusing not just on Margaret but on all the flight nurses who'd served. He'd interviewed Linda and several other women from the area who'd been in Vietnam. The article included the photograph of young Lieutenant Hayes standing in front of the helicopter, next to a current photo of Margaret at the VA hospital. The response was overwhelming. The newspaper's office received dozens of calls from other veterans, from families of soldiers who'd been saved by medevac helicopters, from people who simply wanted to say thank you. Margaret's phone rang constantly. People stopped her in the grocery store, at church, on the street. It was exhausting and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Linda invited her to the Women Veterans Group, and Margaret went, her hands shaking as she walked into the meeting room. There were 8 other women there, ranging in age from their 60s to their 80s. They'd served in different wars, different branches, different roles, but they all understood. For 2 hours, Margaret sat with these women and felt something she hadn't felt in 50 years. The freedom to be honest about her service. To talk about the hard parts without being judged. To express the pride she'd always pushed down because it felt wrong to be proud of something connected to war. "I spent so long trying to be just a regular person," Margaret told the group. "I wanted people to see me as a teacher, a mother, a volunteer. Not as a veteran. Not as someone who'd been to war." An older woman named Patricia, who'd been an army nurse in Korea, nodded knowingly. "We all did that. Because society told us we should. Women weren't supposed to talk about war. We were supposed to come home and be quiet and feminine and forget we'd ever seen combat. But we can't forget," Linda added, "and we shouldn't have to. Our service matters. What we did matters." The day before the trip to North Carolina, Margaret's children arrived at her house. Catherine had driven down from Maryland, and her son David had flown in from California. "They wanted to go with her to see the bell. You don't have to," Margaret protested. "I know you both have busy lives." "Mom," Catherine said firmly, "you're going to see a memorial with your name on it. You're going to ring a bell for 127 missions we never even knew you flew. We're coming." No argument. Robert and his daughter were making the trip too, along with Henry, Walter, and a few other veterans from the reunion. Linda was driving down separately with 2 women from the veterans group. The museum had been alerted that Angel 9 was coming, and they'd arranged a small ceremony. The drive to North Carolina took 4 hours. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Catherine's car, watching the landscape pass by. Her grandchildren, 15-year-old twins, were in the back seat, asking questions about Vietnam, about helicopters, about what it was like to be a flight nurse. Margaret answered their questions as honestly as she could. It felt strange to talk about these things with teenagers, but they listened with genuine interest and respect. They didn't see her as fragile or traumatized. They saw her as someone who'd done something brave and important. The museum was smaller than Margaret had expected, tucked into a quiet corner of a small town. But inside it was beautifully maintained, with exhibits dedicated to different aspects of the Vietnam War. The medevac section was in the back, and that's where the bell was mounted. There it was. Old bell. Larger than it had looked in the photograph, the brass tarnished to a deep golden brown. The names and call signs covered its entire surface, each one engraved by hand. Margaret walked up to it slowly, her children on either side of her. She found her call sign easily. Angel 9, right where Walter had shown her in the photo. Above it were the names of 2 pilots who hadn't made it home. Below it was Angel 7, the call sign of another flight nurse she'd known. They'd been friends, had shared a barracks, had traded stories about their missions. She made it home, Margaret said quietly, touching Angel 7's engraving. She got married, moved to Texas. We lost touch after the war. Maybe we could find her, Catherine suggested. With the internet, it should be possible. Margaret nodded, the idea taking root. There were so many people she'd lost touch with. So many friends from that time that she'd let slip away because staying connected meant staying connected to memories she'd wanted to forget. The museum director approached, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes. Ms. Brennan, we're so honored to have you here. We've had dozens of people visit this bell over the years, but you're the first flight nurse. The first angel, she gestured to the bell. Whenever someone whose name is on the bell visits, we invite them to ring it. However many times feels right. Some people ring it once. Some ring it for every mission, every person saved. It's entirely up to you. Margaret looked at the bell. Fund 27 missions, 342 soldiers. How many rings was that worth? How do you quantify lives saved? Moments of courage, hours of fear and exhaustion and determination. The small group gathered around her. Veterans, family members, museum staff, strangers who'd heard about the ceremony and come to witness it. All of them quiet, respectful, waiting. Margaret reached out and gripped the rope attached to the bell's clapper. It was smooth and worn from years of use. She thought about all the people who'd rung this bell before her. Pilots, crew chiefs, medics, soldiers who'd been saved, each one marking their connection to the war, their survival, their service. She rang the bell once. The sound was deep and resonant, filling the museum, echoing off the walls. She thought about Lieutenant Margaret Hayes, 23 years old, climbing onto a helicopter for her first mission. Terrified but determined, she rang it again. She thought about the faces of the young men she'd treated. So many faces. Some she could still see clearly, others had faded with time. Again, she thought about the ones who'd died, the ones she couldn't save, the guilt she'd carried for 50 years, wondering if she could have done more, worked faster, made different choices. Again, she thought about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about the war, about taking off her uniform and becoming invisible, about the decades of silence. Again, she thought about that day 3 weeks ago when Robert had recognized her, when her past had come flooding back, when she'd been forced to face everything she'd been running from. Again. She thought about her children standing beside her, finally knowing the truth about who she was, about the women in the veterans group who understood, about the men at the reunion who'd never forgotten Angel 9. Again. She thought about all the years she'd spent believing her service didn't matter, that it was better to forget, that she was just someone who'd done a job that needed doing again. And finally, she thought about this moment standing in front of a bell with her call sign engraved on it, surrounded by people who saw her and valued her and honored what she'd done. She rang the bell one more time and then she stopped. 9 rings for Angel 9. Not one for every mission or every person saved, but 9 for the identity she'd tried to erase and was finally reclaiming. The museum was silent except for the fading echoes of the bell. Then Robert started clapping and the others joined in. It wasn't loud or showy, Jay.